It's James Spittlecombe and Wafa Bouaziz. James is an expert in CTR strategy and specializes in business transformation. He has worked with the CTR over the last 7 years, holding roles at EMA, Deloitte, and now DLRC. At DLRC, James is the CTR lead and focuses on supporting clients and colleagues with CTR requirements, readiness, and submissions. Wafa is a global regulatory professional with a broad experience across various therapeutic areas. With a strong scientific, regulatory, and managerial expertise, she successfully led both early development projects and full development programs. She has supported clients with several investigational products through their European regulatory journey, advising on CTA requirements from a strategic perspective. She also acts as the EU legal representative under CTR and helps companies ensuring compliance with the new regulation. And I would now like to hand you over to our speakers of today. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. Welcome all to our webinar on CTR and what you really need to know. So on the next slide, we've just got 6 key points and topics that we want to talk through with you today. First, I'm going to talk about CTR in the context of the EU regulatory landscape. I'm then going to talk about CTR foundations, just make sure that everyone is baselined across that. We're going to spend about 5 to 10 minutes on the foundation side before handing over to Wafa, who's going to sort of take it up a gear and talk about a spotlight on her role as an EU legal representative, and then talking about the CTR impact on study design. And then I'm going to conclude on the last 2 points on managing a transition from directive to regulation, and also look at the latest revised EU CTR transparency rules. So on the next slide, I've just posed a question really, and it's sorry, I was muted there. What do you really need to know about CTR and its related legislation? And really, the important thing here is to understand that the CTR is only one piece in the EU regulatory puzzle. And it's quite complicated. And to help us really illustrate this complexity, we've come up with the next slide. So I did give you a heads up that it was quite complicated, because right in the middle, we've got the CTR compliance, and you can see all of these linkages to all other EU regulation and guidances as well. So we're not just looking at CTR compliance here, we're looking at, ICH E6R3 on GCP, we're looking at M11 for protocol templates, we're looking at GDPR feeding in, pediatric regulation, all of those directives on the right-hand side, including things around advanced therapies, consolidated scientific advice, and in the top left, you've got ACT-EU that are frequently updating a lot of the guidances. So my statement before still stands. The CTR is only a single piece within this EU regulatory puzzle. So Wafa and my aim over the next 45 minutes or so is to try and break this down for you and try and go through what you really need to know about it. And to start off, I'm going to pinpoint focus on that CTR compliance in navy in the circle in the middle. And on the next slide, I've attempted to summarize the key parts of CTR within a page. So we're going to spend about 5 to 10 minutes just making sure that everyone is baselined. We'll look at the foundations of the CTR, and then I'll hand to Wafa. So I've got 4 key things that I want to talk you through. In the top left, I think it's still important to revisit aims and targeted outcomes of the CTR. So we're looking at number 1, highest standard of safety and efficacy for trial subjects, if not the most important thing, I think, with the CTR. And Wafa's going to talk to some of these points later. Point number 2 is really to harmonize the process of conducting studies across the EU. We're going from a state of a relatively decentralized directive environment into a much more harmonized regulation. And I'm going to talk to that in more detail on point 3 of the slide. Aim number 3 is really facilitation of cross-border collaboration, in particular with member states. Again, looking at this harmonized environment, facilitation of studies through a single system really helps with that sort of inter-member state collaboration. And finally, promotion of transparency and accountability. And I'm going to talk through the latest revised rules of CTR transparency at the end of the talk. Now, with new regulation, indeed with any new change, you're almost certainly going to have challenges. And so in the bottom left, we've highlighted what we consider as the top 3 just to consider from a CTR perspective. First being the implementation complexities. And you can look at this through different lenses. You can look at it from not just the regulation side, but also IT, from quality, QMS and compliance side, from all these different lenses and aspects. And I think that the CTR contains a lot of information, but we saw on the previous slide that you have all of these other linked areas as well. And so that just enhances that implementation complexities there. So that's why we put it as number 1. Number 2, the CTR in and of itself has quite a lot of details and information, but also change from how we were used to working under the directive. And so compliance with these new requirements, getting used to a new way of working in something that most of us are already quite familiar with is also a challenge in and of itself. Point number 3 we've mentioned stakeholder adjustments. In my experience, it's something that's not often thought of first, and the classic is always, oh, clinical trial regulation, well, that's Reg Affairs' job to do, right? And it's really not. I think we're going into a harmonized environment with a regulation, and I think that really needs to be reflective within an organization to be able to operate compliantly, but also efficiently as well. And so it's not just reg looking at this, it's also involvement of other functions, PV, quality, clinical operations, etc. Because to really work compliantly and effectively under the CTR, you have to operate as a single cohesive machine. I think that's the real way to sort of look at CTR. It's a harmonized regulation. Make sure you're reflecting that within a business model as well. In the top right in gray, I'm just going to talk through the application because it does change a fair bit from what we've been used to before. So the application assessment is built up of 3 stages. You've got a validation, which lasts 10 days. You've got a parallel assessment, part 1, part 2, and I'll talk about what that is, for 45 days. And then you're concluding with a decision per member state that's 5 days. So you're looking at a 60-day window without any questions. Your part 1 is comprised of your standard competent authority submissions, so your protocol IB, IMPD, labels, etc. There is one part 1 for all EU member state concerned. Your part 2 is your classic ethics. So you're looking at informed consent form, recruitment arrangements, you're looking at investigator and site information. There is one part 2 per EU member state concerned. So if you submit to 5 countries in the EU, you have 5 respective national part 2s. You will see underneath, I've put in bold high risk. The real high risk with an assessment is the RFI, or request for information, response times. If you get questions in validation, you have 10 calendar days to respond. If you have questions in the assessment phase, you have 12 calendar days to respond. So you're automatically including a weekend in there somewhere. Sometimes phrased as helpful, what will happen in generally speaking is that member states will tend to ask both the part 1 and the part 2 questions at the same time, because you may have questions on a document in part 1 that impacts a document in part 2. I'm thinking sort of protocol and ICF, protocol being part 1 and ICF being part 2. And so if that's the case, to be able for you to update both, the questions are raised at the same time for both part 1 and part 2. Now, that's obviously useful to update the documents. It's not quite as useful when you realize that all of your questions are happening at the same time and you have 12 calendar days to respond to all of them. To make things worse, if you have patient-facing documentation, these will need to be translated into local languages, has to be done within the 12 calendar days. You can't ask for an extension. If you fail to respond to the questions, your application lapses and you have to resubmit from day 0. This is why we're describing it as a high-risk area. So as part of the application assessment, make sure that there's adequate resource allocation, planning, etc. Again, questions can be allocated across different functions. That comes back to the point around that cohesion. Lastly, in the bottom right, before you submit, I've specifically mentioned this because it's often something that's only realized as you go into the system. And I really want you to understand that this is something you need to look at and consider now, and don't let it delay an application submission. So before you submit, there are 4 key things that you need to check. Number 1, do you need an EU legal representative, and have you got one established? So if you're based outside of the EU as a sponsor, you need an EU legal rep. And Wafa's going to talk in a much more detail on that in a minute or so. Number 2, you need to make sure, and this is especially important for first-time sponsors within the EU, you need to register yourself as a sponsor in EudraVigilance. And number 3, register in OMS. OMS is the Organizational Management Service, forms part of SPORT. It registers you as a company or as an organization. It allows you to create studies within the system. Number 4, make sure that all IMPs and auxiliary products are registered in XEVMPD. If they're not registered, you can't retrieve them in the application. So if you're sat there thinking, hang on a second, I think I might need all 4 of these. Firstly, please check now, don't let it delay a submission. But I'd probably say, without any major delays, I'd probably allocate 3 months to get all 4 of these sorted. So please make sure that this is considered now, not considered at the time where you figure out you can't actually create an application in CTIS because you're missing some of these elements. And with that, I'll just focus, we're just going to laser focus in on the EU legal representative part, and I'll hand to Wafa, who's going to talk to you about it from her perspective. Wafa.
Okay, thanks, James. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that we took you through the key features of CTR and presented this a brief overview of the changes, the important question for which I believe a lot of you are here to have an answer is, how do these changes impact your clinical trial design and more broadly your clinical development strategy, compliance and best practices for the EU? Next slide, please. So on this slide, I focused mainly on the journey and the key elements of CTR that will impact your trial design and CTA strategy to take you to hopefully a successful CTA filing. But before I dive into that, I couldn't resist but include the scientific advice framework as well as the pediatric regulation. As you know now, or as you knew maybe, CTR is a streamlined and centralized process as opposed to the CTD. And it hopes to reduce administrative burden and enables hopefully more efficient resource allocation for all the different stakeholders involved in the process. However, as you can imagine, when having multiple EU member states involved, these may have a different perspective on your clinical plan. So seeking scientific advice, may it be through the centralized procedure or through the national advice processes, is going to give you an idea of what do the EU regulators think about your clinical strategy. The pediatric regulation, and particularly the PIP, is another aspect that you should consider before engaging in a pediatric CTA filing. As you may know, the PDCO is the committee that is in charge of pediatric plans and conducting a pediatric study that has design elements that do not align with your agreed PIP, or engaging, for example, in a pediatric pivotal study where you do not have an agreed PIP, enhances the chances for your CTA to be rejected. And you may be sitting there and thinking, but these are 2 separate procedures. Why would that matter? And in fact, we did have situations where CTAs, pediatric CTAs particularly, were being rejected because of the absence of an agreed PIP. Something else can happen is that your CTA gets approved without an agreed PIP. And when you get closer to your marketing planning and you start discussing with the PDCO, you may realize that you've collected clinical data that may not be considered supportive for your registration in the EU. And to add a little bit more complexity, even if you do everything right, and we did see that as well in the past, with a situation where there was an agreed pediatric plan, the CTA did include both adults and pediatrics. And what happened during the CTA evaluation is that the assessors evaluating the CTA refused it because they considered that the inclusion of pediatrics was not duly justified. So even if as a sponsor, you have these tools obviously to mitigate these risks, there are sometimes misalignments between these bodies, and these are these regulatory bodies, and this is something that you really need to consider before submitting a CTA in the EU. And this is why I wanted to spend some time on the scientific advice framework and the pediatric regulation. They are really at the heart of your clinical design in the EU. Now we can move on to the next topic, and the first CTR change that can impact your clinical strategy in the EU. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. So what do you really need to know about the EU legal representative role? So this is obviously required for those sponsors who do not have a presence in the EEA. However, if you do have a presence in the EEA and you do not need an EU legal representative, stay with me. I promise it's going to be interesting because I will be addressing those CTR compliance elements that are also important to the sponsor, just as they are to the EU legal rep. So since the application of CTR, things have obviously changed. So if you look at the CTD and search for the terms legal representative, you will see this text to the left under Article 19. The sponsor or a legal representative of the sponsor must be established in the community. So the CTD required to have an EU legal rep for those sponsors not established in the community. And this legal representative was more of a contact point that was interacting with the regulatory bodies in the EU on behalf of the sponsor. Some would even call it was a letterbox, which you can tell from my tone, I don't appreciate it much. So if you look at the CTR to the right, under Article 74, the regulation really adds more details. And in fact, the responsibility of the EU legal rep has significantly increased. So what is an EU legal rep under the CTR? It is a natural or legal person that is established in the Union, and they are responsible for ensuring compliance with the sponsor's obligations pursuant to this regulation. So what does that mean? So it means that the EU legal representative cannot be just someone that signs on cover letters and forms to enable CTA filings. It is someone that has a responsibility to ensure the sponsor and the sponsor's obligation or the sponsor's CTR compliance. So next slide, please. I wanted to give you a little bit of the key learnings that I got from my experience acting as a legal representative signatory for several clinical trials in the EU. And as I just mentioned, with this enhanced responsibility, the legal representative is taking a risk when acting so. And this is why what we do is that we conduct a compliance gap analysis to make sure that the clinical trial setup, as well as its conduct, is done in compliance with CTR. So some of the common shortcomings that we've seen when conducting such an analysis is that there's a lack of clarity about the end-to-end responsibilities of the various business partners involved in the trial. So if the responsibilities are not well defined, there is obviously a higher risk for deviations and incompliances. The second point is there's often insufficient evidence that sponsor or its CROs, standard operating procedures, and more generally their quality management system, cover all the necessary sponsors trial related duties under the CTR, but also under the GCP, because as we just mentioned, if you're considering your clinical, when considering your clinical strategy in the EU, you cannot look at CTR in isolation. You have to also look at the related EU legislations, and GCP is clearly very important. So I hope this is going to be one of the takeaway messages that you're going to have from our webinar. The third point is, and this is, I think, is due to the lack of awareness that the EU legal representative responsibility has significantly increased under CTR. What we also have seen is that the insurance certificates that are that cover the clinical trial often do not include the legal representative. So under the CTR, the EU legal representative is definitely not a letterbox, and it becomes an additional safeguard for CTR and GCP adherence. And so it is an integral part of the sponsor's compliance strategy and best practices. Next slide, please. So now that we talked about the legal rep and touch base as well on CTR compliance, let's move on to what you really need to know about quality control and data integrity. What struck me when reading the CTR first is the number of times where this statement appears: the reliability and robustness of the data generated in the clinical trial. This really emphasizes that one of the key expected impacts on clinical design and strategy is that more rigorous data collection procedures and controls are put in place when setting up a trial in the EU. So how would you effectively ensure the reliability and robustness of the data you generate in your trials? Well, the first thing to do is the first regulation that answers that is obviously CTR itself. And one of the provisions indicates that clinical trials must follow detailed protocols outlining study objectives, methodology, participant eligibility criteria, treatment procedures, and endpoints. And these protocols must be designed to minimize bias and ensure the reliability of your collected data. So protocols and relevant documentation such as the IB must be concise, straight to the point, and clear, so that the investigators and people using them are, clear on how the data collection procedures and controls are put in place. I believe that there's also another provision of CTR that can help sponsors with that I have not indicated here, and James is going to go through this later on. I think that transparency and the requirement for redactions is also a positive element that will contribute to that, as protocols and IBs, etc., are now viewed with a different angle, so they must contain only this necessary information for the for proper conduct of the trial. I will touch base on informed consent later, and we've already discussed a little bit the QMS. So allow me to move on to the adherence to GCP. So compliance with GCP guidelines, as we mentioned, is essential to ensure reliability and robustness of data. So GCP ICH E6 provides internationally recognized standards for the design, conduct, monitoring, and reporting, and it is going to help minimize bias and ensure data integrity. So if you look to the right, I've depicted as well here some very important concepts that you're going to see in the GCP. And for those who've been to that workshop from the EMA last summer, which was to discuss the third revision to ICH E6, you're probably familiar with this terminology here, which is that the agency is really advocating for a risk-based approach, meaning that your protocols must be fit for purpose and must consider those high risks that are identified when it comes to patient safety, or also those biases that can threaten data integrity. So by having a risk-based approach and a fit-for-purpose protocol, what you're allowing effectively is an evidence-based decision-making, right? There are also other elements in the GCP and CTR, such as data management, monitoring, and oversight. But again, you have also to consider other guidelines, such as the guideline on the computerized systems and electronic data in clinical trials. Now, I'm not the ultimate expert in that, so please do not ask me too many questions about that. But it does tell you how these computerized systems must be validated to ensure data integrity. So it goes through the standardized processes, how to ensure, how to have data security measures in place, and also how to validate these systems. Now, the regulators have been quite flexible when it comes to validation because each system is going to be different. So the way to validate these systems is really going to be done on a case by case. So by implementing all these measures, by looking at the GCP, the CTR, and extra related guidelines, sponsors, investigators, and regulatory authorities aim to basically work together to ensure that reliability and robustness is obtained when conducting a clinical trial in the EU. Next slide, please. Let's move on to what you really need to know about patient involvement. Next slide, please. So the new EU regulation emphasizes the importance of patient involvement in the design, conduct, and the evaluation of clinical trials. So what is the expected impact of this change to the regulation? So it aims to promote inclusion of patient-reported outcomes. It aims to enhance participant recruitment and retention strategies, as well as improve the overall trial relevance and feasibility. So how to efficiently involve patients and promote their engagement in your trials. So the CTR has, in fact, 4 articles that address patient involvement. The first one is Article 5, which outlines the requirements for obtaining informed consent from trial participants, ensuring that they are adequately informed about the trial's purpose, procedures, risks, and benefits before agreeing to participate. The second article is Article 34, which mandates the provision of a lay summary of trial results to trial participants in a language that they can easily understand, allowing them to access and understand the outcomes of the trial they participated in. And then 37 and 38 addresses access to clinical trial data upon request, again, enabling particularly patients and patient organizations to see this data that is relevant to their interests and contributes to the interpretation and dissemination of trial results. So clearly what the guidance is aiming for is a patient-centered approach and the use of PROs and clinically relevant endpoints to understand whether these patients are likely to benefit from the investigational drug that is being tested. So again, it's all about making these protocols fit for purpose. I wanted to touch base very briefly on another EU regulatory framework, which is the upcoming joint consultation assessment and the HTA assessment. And in fact, collecting this patient-centered data is also is key in your clinical trial, but it's also important for your future registration and overall development strategy, as these are elements that the HTA bodies are going to be very interested in when it comes to the reimbursement negotiations. So these articles of the CTR aim to ensure that patients are adequately informed, engaged, and empowered throughout the trial process and have access to these trial results and data that are relevant to them. So that was patient involvement in one slide. Obviously there's way more in the regulation that you can look at, but unfortunately we have only 1 hour. Otherwise, I would be very happy to spend more time talking about this topic, which I believe is really critical for the clinical development in the EU. Next slide, please. So let's move on to what you really need to know about patient monitoring and safety reporting. And here again, okay, I didn't do it in 1 slide, but it's 2. So next slide, please. Okay, patient monitoring. So the CTR aims to increase or have a more rigorous safety monitoring procedures, and these are described under Article 48. So the impact is to promote, again, this risk-based approach, to leverage remote monitoring technologies, and again, adopt a patient-centric approach. So if we look at the frequency and intensity of monitoring, so the regulation emphasizes, again, this risk-based approach. It focuses resources on areas of highest risk to patient safety and data quality. This may result in adjustments to the frequency and intensity of monitoring activities throughout the trial, potentially influencing the design decisions, such as the choice of endpoints, sample size calculations, and obviously the allocation of resources. When we look at remote monitoring technologies, so with the advancements in the remote monitoring technologies, the CTR encourages the use of electronic data capture systems, as we've just touched base on earlier, and centralized monitoring approaches to complement the traditional on-site monitoring visits. So this may allow for more efficient and cost-effective study designs with reduced reliance on frequent on-site visits and a greater flexibility in patient participation. And then finally, you see this patient-centric approach comes back very often in the regulation, and it aims again to, so the CTR aims again to promote these approaches to clinical trial design and conduct. It emphasizes the importance of patient input and engagement throughout the trial process. And it also advocates for the monitoring activities to be tailored to accommodate patient preferences and needs, to ensure that these protocols are aligned with the realities of patient participation and fostering a more patient-friendly research environment. Next slide, please. And then last but not least, before I move it to James, let's talk briefly about safety reporting. So the CTR here, again, puts a greater emphasis on patient safety, and it aims to promote proactive risk assessment, a timely safety reporting, as well as an appropriate risk mitigation strategies throughout the clinical trial life cycle. So Annex 13 is the section of the CTR that addresses that. And I wanted to go briefly through these 5 points here. So the CTR mandates the development of a comprehensive safety monitoring plan for each clinical trial, outlining procedures for the selection, for the collection, assessment, and reporting of AEs and SAEs. This requirement may influence study design decisions by necessitating the inclusion of specific safety monitoring measures and endpoints to adequately capture and evaluate safety data. The second point is risk assessment. So prior to initiating a clinical trial, sponsors are required to conduct a thorough risk assessment to identify potential safety concerns and develop appropriate risk mitigation strategies. This risk assessment will inform as well and impact design decisions, such as the selection of study population, the inclusion and exclusion criteria, dosing regimens, and monitoring procedures to minimize the likelihood of AEs and ensure patient safety. The third point is safety reporting, and sponsors have to ensure that issues such as unexpected events, serious breaches, and urgent safety measures are submitted within the time frames set in the regulation. And this is why you have to make sure that your quality management system and that the responsibilities of the different stakeholders involved in the trial are clearly identified, so you can effectively report these events on time. Indeed, the CTR has very strict timelines for the reporting of safety-related information, such as SAEs and SUSARs. And these reporting timelines as well may impact your study design by necessitating the implementation of efficient data collection and reporting systems, as well as contingency plans for managing and responding to safety events in a timely manner. Safety monitoring committees. In certain cases, the regulation may require the establishment of independent safety monitoring committees to oversee the ongoing safety of the trial. The involvement of these committees can also influence your study design decisions by providing additional oversight and expertise in safety monitoring, potentially leading to modifications in your study protocols, treatment interventions, or participant follow-up procedures. And then finally, protocol modifications. So if there is any significant safety concerns, the regulation allows you to modify your protocol and put the appropriate mitigation strategies in place. So with that, I'm going to give it back to James to take you through the harmonization of protocols and transition. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Wafa. So the last two topics here, I'm going to talk about transitioning a study. And what does that mean and how do you do it from the directive to regulation? And then finalize and close with transparency. By the way, I may have forgotten to mention at the beginning, if you do have a question, we're going to have a few minutes pause before we summarize. And so if you do have a question, please pop it in the chat. And we'll take a few minutes after these next couple of sections to try and answer as many as possible. So next slide, please. And with the title says it all for this slide. You are on the clock with this one. It may seem like a long way away. It's really not. To try and help with a directive to regulation transition, I find it normally quite helpful to break it down into three distinct stages. So stage one, we have pre-transition activities. Stage two is your transition application in CTIS and getting that approved under the regulation. And then step three, we have a post-transition application authorization alignment, or shortened to alignment, as a stage three. So we'll start with stage one on the left-hand side. There are 4 key points here on pre-transition activities. The first is really that point around a harmonized or at least consolidated protocol. And really, right at the beginning of the slide, if you remember it, in that number 3 in the gray in the top right-hand corner, we spoke about one part 1 for the EU, or one part 1 for the EU member states. This means you have one protocol for your EU member state concerned, and it should be the same. It should be harmonized across the EU. Now, that's a lot easier if you're doing an initial submission under the regulation, because you can proactively design and write a harmonized protocol. It can be slightly trickier if you have an existing study under the directive, whereby you have lots of different member states with different versions of the protocol, different bits and pieces that are approved across each one, and it suddenly becomes difficult, if not near impossible, to have a completely harmonized protocol. This is where the consolidated protocol comes into play. And so a consolidated protocol is one in which there can be differences between the member states, but you're essentially consolidating it into one, and you're describing those differences within an appendix. And so if you can't absolutely 100% harmonize, then a consolidated protocol may be the way to go. There are certain aspects that you have to keep the same though, so just bear that in mind. These are the UDRA-CT number, the trial title, protocol version number, primary objective, primary endpoint, definition of end of study. You should also keep your main inclusion and exclusion criteria the same, but there is leeway and flexibility if you have member state specific differences like age population groups, for example. That's an allowed variance. And so if you're struggling with a complete harmonization, have a look at the consolidation route and see if that makes things easier for that sort of pre-transition activity. The next is to prepare a, quote, minimum dossier. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by minimum dossier? If I were to give this talk about a year ago, you'd have to provide essentially a fully aligned CTR documentation in this stage. You don't anymore. It's why we have an alignment afterwards. And so it's acceptable to provide this minimum dossier of information that you've had authorized under the directive, limited to protocol, IB, GMP documentation, IMPD, informed consent form, and subject information sheet. You'll also need a new cover letter and GDPR compliance statement as well as part of that. But most of the Part 2 documents that we classically didn't have under the directive are not in scope of this minimum dossier. And so you don't have to provide it at the first stage of transition. The last 2 points link back to what I said right at the beginning. Register in the systems. If you're not registered in the systems, you won't be able to create a study in CTIS, and or you won't be able to add your IMPs and auxiliary products to the study. Make sure the registrations are in place. And lastly, if you're not in the EU, make sure that you have an EU legal representative allocated. Once all that stage 1 activities are complete, you should be ready to transition the application. So this is entering into stage 2. This is where you're putting the application into CTIS, clicking the submit button and waiting for its authorization. Some key things to mention here are, if you go down this minimum dossier route, you should be eligible for an expedited review timeline. If you've got a really good memory, you remember that the assessment timeline as standard is 60 days. It's reduced down to 22 in an expedited review timeline. It's over a month, and so you should really leverage this route if you can. Some real life experience on this. Some member states seem to not follow this expedited review timeline, even though the understanding is that the scope is within an expedited review. I think the real take home from this is that it's not just the sponsor side that is going through a change here, it's member states as well. And so just bear that in mind, and I think that should be reflective of the appropriate level and tone of communication as well. The second point on stage 2, RFIs, requests for information, the part that I highlighted in bold as a high risk. You can have questions as part of a transition application. Make sure you are in the system, monitoring the assessment and seeing if you have the questions. Because again, with this, if you don't respond to those questions in time, your transition would lapse and you'd have to resubmit the transition. So make sure you're actively looking at this. As a little bit of a heads up, we have seen that sometimes there are questions that are asked on documents that are outside of the minimum dossier, and just be wary of this, and just a heads up on that sort of things, reiterating the point before around it being a bit of a change for member states as well. In the blue on top of this box here, need to do this by the end of January 2025, not submitted, authorized under the regulation. So it's completed stage 2 by the end of January 2025. I know that sounds like ages away. It's really not. So please plan now. After you've done the stage 2, you'll enter into stage 3, which is getting the minimum dossier and the documents that are in CTIS to be fully aligned with the CTR legislation, and mostly Annex 1, which lists out all of the documents and their requirements. And so this is something that you have to do at the time of the first substantial modification after your transition authorization. And it matches. So what I mean by this is that if you're updating the IB, for example, that's a Part 1 document. As part of that substantial modification for the IB, you align the rest of the Part 1, and that's all of the Part 1 to the requirements of the CTR, and that's the documentation. If you were adding a trial site, that's a part 2 substantial modification. You're then aligning your complete part 2 as part of that substantial modification. So it's that alignment phase that takes the documents from the minimum dossier in stage 1 into the sort of fully aligned as part of stage 3. And hopefully that sort of helps to facilitate this transition side of things. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that we're coming near to the end. We've got about 10, 11 minutes left. I'm just going to focus for the last 5 minutes or so on transparency, and on the next slide talk about the revised transparency rules and what this means and how you can take advantage of these new rules now. So in the next slide, I'm going to just give a very, very quick history lesson as to how this all came about. Similar to the transition, and again, reiterating the fact that this information is changing relatively frequently. This time last year, if I gave the talk, it would be easier for me to tell you what was not made public under the CTR than for me to list out everything that was. That's how bold of a step it was in terms of CTR and the transparency. But throughout last year, ACT-EU submitted surveys and sort of gathered information from various representatives on these rules. And in October and then December, released new transparency rules that could be from that date applied to initial submissions. And so you can, from then, and indeed from now, take advantage of those new transparency rules. The thing to watch out for, and the thing to really note here, is in the dark blue on the top right, is that CTIS as a system is not going to be updated to reflect the new rules until later this year. Earliest end of Q2, expect it within H2 this year. So you can follow the new rules, but just note that the system itself isn't reflective of these new rules at the current moment in time. What does this mean in practice? In practice, you are looking at a reduced scope in terms of the information and documentation that's made public. So before it was a lot of information, it was almost everything. Now it's switched to more of a patient focus. So if we're looking at a phase 1, for example, you're publishing protocol, the synopsis, the patient-facing documents, and your results summary at the end of the study. It's a lot less than it was before. If you're looking at other sort of non-phase 2 studies at phase 2, phase 3, then you're also publishing the informed consent form, the patient information sheet, and recruitment arrangements, so advertisement materials and things like this. So it's reduced scope. The IB, I think, is a key document that used to be made public, is no longer in scope of the publication under these new rules. Before, you could defer the availability of these documents through the deferral mechanism. That is removed in the new rules. So what it means is that the reduced scope of documents are made public on the date of decision of the application. So it's a lot shorter. Beforehand, I could have said the protocol you could defer for up to 5 years after the end of the study. The deferral does not exist. And I think that's actually an advantage. I think that a really common question was, well, if I have a deferral, can I redact the information as well? I'll touch on redaction in a second. And what do I do? What's the balance between a protection via deferral and a protection via redaction? And I think that was a really difficult sort of balance and sort of gauge to have here. For the documents that are made public, the redaction process still applies. It's just you're doing it for fewer documents. So you still need to protect your commercially confidential information. You still need to protect protected personal data as well within these documents. So make sure that is done. That needs to be done before you upload and submit. It can't be done as a sort of a retroactive activity. It has to be done proactively. The last point that I'll make here is to do with this slight disparity between following new rules within a system that's not updated yet. And in particular with regard to RFI responses, but I think generally as well to information, is be careful because you are following these new rules in a system that isn't updated. If you go into CTIS now, you will see the deferral functionality still within the system. The old system thinks that RFI responses are made public. And so the real message here is understand the new rules, but be particularly meticulous in terms of how you're updating and uploading that information in CTIS, where you're putting the information, if you're putting the redacted document and the unredacted document in the same place and location within the system, because it's easy to get wrong. I have seen it been done incorrectly within the CTIS public workspace, where protected personal data is within the public domain. Make sure that's not you. Make sure you're also protecting your commercially confidential information as well. And with that, the next slide should say, any questions? Sorry, Wafa, I'm gonna put you on the spot because
I think that there's
you've had more time to look. And if we don't get through all of them now, then we can follow up offline. I'm sure that's absolutely fine.
Yeah, sure. There's a first question, James. I think it's about more of a procedural question, so I'm going to give that to you. If a medicinal product CT is registered under CTIS, which is delivered using a medical device, how do I report issues with the device? Do I report via CTIS, or do I have to report to each EU member state regulatory authority separately?
I would rather reply offline. I'd rather consult with our MedTech lead. I don't want to give you information that's incorrect. If that's okay, Alan, I see you've mentioned the chat. Yes, you do add the medicinal product and the related medicinal product within CTIS itself. With regards to reporting issues, if Eric, if you sort of send me the question, I can get back to you with someone with a MedTech specialism to make sure that you get the correct answer on this.
Thank you, James.
No problem.
To the question from Nadine, what would be a recommended strategy if the clinical trial needs other submissions such as radiations or GMO, which are not handled via CTIS? So this is a very good question, Nadine, and as we've mentioned earlier, CTR alone does not give you all the answers, particularly if it is one of those so related to a radioactive compound or to a gene therapy or GMO. So you have to look at this list of directives that we've listed above or in our first slide. I don't know, Laura, if you can get back to that slide with the different directives. So 2 of them are for the radioactive compounds and the rest are for ATMPs and GTMPs. And so, well, one of the things that it's not really, it's okay, we can consider it is strategic, but so in the cover letter of your CTR, you'll have to mention that the IMP obviously contains GMO, but what is also important is that you have to prepare your contained use or your deliberate release filing in parallel, or you can decide in which order you can submit them. In fact, the regulation does not indicate what is the best sequence, so it's going to be dependent on the member states in which you're going to conduct your clinical trial. But ideally, you want to start thinking about these quite early and aim to, at least do them in parallel before you submit your CTA filing. And although this, of course, would expose you to the risk of not having a final protocol to prepare your deliberate release or contained use, application. But this would be the best way to handle it, as at the moment the legislation does not, give very clear indications on what would be the best sequence. So that, I hope that answers your question.
Very quickly, I know we've got about a minute or so left. I just want to conclude. Again, thanks for raising the questions, and if there's something that we haven't got back to, then we can follow up offline. The deferred documents. So just to very quickly on the deferred document side, the question that I've just spotted as well. So under the new rules, the deferral doesn't exist. And so we're going to a default publication time, which is the date of the decision of the application. So you submit your protocol, ICF, etc., as part of your initial submission. It's after that 60 days plus questions, the decision is made. That's the trigger for the publication. So in theory, you haven't started your study yet, and your protocol and related documents are going to be available in the CTIS public workspace. And that's the removal of the deferral. That's the impact on that side of things. So if we go to the next slide, and we'll distribute these slides to everyone, because I'll go through this very briefly now, but I really want everyone to sort of have this as a takeaway, and just in the next week or so, just have a look and just really reflect on this, because hopefully it helps you in just digesting the sheer volume of information that's available. So we sort of pose these as a question. So have you considered that positioning of the EU legal representative, if you need one, in relation to CTR GCP adherence? If you don't need one, then have you considered what Wafa mentioned around the whole compliance piece and sort of the QMS piece? Have you considered that data collection procedure, robustness and integrity of the data, reliability and robustness of data that's always mentioned in the CTR? Have you considered that patient involvement, how that relates to even an HTA assessment at the end? Have you considered that risk-based approach? Have you considered the safety reporting, but also the management of the trial throughout its life cycle? How's that going to be done? Have you considered a current pipeline? You may have studies that need to transition. Have you considered those 3 stages, how you're going to transition them before the end of January next year? And how are you leveraging that expedited review process that I think is going to be really useful? And how are you protecting your commercially confidential information and personal data in your documents that are inevitably going to be made public under the new transparency rules? And with that, I'll just post on the next slide, please, Laura. Thank you so much for attending. We hope it's been useful in understanding what you need to know about the CTR. As we said, it's only an hour. We could talk for days and days and days on the information that's available. But thank you so much for attending. We'll save information on the chat. We have contact information on here if you want to get in touch. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.